Good morning, everyone, and welcome back to the Global Health Uncensored podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Banda Khalifa. Today's guest is a global health trailblazer. He's a pioneer in infectious disease genomics and a leader in Africa led scientific innovation. He was recently named one of Time's 100 most influential people in health. He currently serves as director of the Africa Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases at Redeemers University, and he's an adjunct professor at Harvard University. But beyond the titles, what stands out most is his commitment to building systems that serve communities across Africa. Without much wasting time, I would like to invite our esteemed host, Professor Christian Happi. Professor Happi, first of all, congratulations on being named one of Time's 100 most influential people in health. I think it's a recognition of your work that you've led and how you've shaped science directly by serving communities across Africa. It's a true honor to have you with us today on this podcast.
Thank you very much, Khalifa. Thank you for the invitation. I think it's a privilege to be here on your platform.
Awesome. And I know you've won several awards throughout your career. I was reading your amazing profile. But when you first saw your name on the Times 100 most influential, what was the first thought that came in your mind? Did it feel like a personal milestone or did it bring up something deeper for you?
I just want to say that this year was incredible for me because first I was named one of the most 100 most influential people in the world from Time magazine. And then secondly, I received another endorsement, which was 100 most influential people in health. So that was double recognition. But for me, I think it came as a sign of recognition of the work that we're doing in Africa. It came as a sign of respect for Africa science. It came as a way to recognize that we could do good science and then respect the science on the African continent. Personally, I think, of course, it's a pleasure to see oneself on the list of Time magazine twice in the same year. But I do believe that for me, it should be basically a signal to other brothers, sisters, African scientists on the continent and then even the diaspora to recognize the fact that if you do good science, wherever you are, that work will be recognized. And I think it is obvious with this double endorsement from Time Magazine this year that Africa is on the rise.
You're absolutely right. As you said, if you do good science, it doesn't matter where you are, you'll be recognized. And I think that you being named twice within the same year is extraordinary. Thank you so much for all you're doing for the continent. But I usually like to take it a little back because my viewers love to hear stories about our guests, how everything started. So I want us to take it back a little. Could you share what your early life and educational journey was like? Where did you grow up and how did those early experiences in Africa shape your interest in science and the path you eventually followed?
I was born and then I grew up in the southern part of Cameroon in Central Africa. And I grew up in an environment where a lot of infectious diseases were endemic, and then on the top of the list was malaria. And I want to say that malaria as a disease somehow shaped my life, shaped my career, and virtually directed and determined who I am today. And this is my story. I grew up from a family of a very modest family. But then I remember when I was 9 years, between 8 and 9, I was sick and very sick. I had one of the worst bouts of malaria that I've ever had. I know I had malaria several times when I was young, but that particular one was horrible. I couldn't stand, I couldn't walk. And I remember my mother carrying me on her back and taking me to a missionary hospital. And that hospital was in my school, the Catholic school. I went to a Catholic school and she took me to a missionary Catholic school. That's where we used to receive treatment. Of course, I did get an injection. And with that injection at the time, I couldn't walk. And then my mother was back, she backed me and then she was taking me back home, trekking.
Mhm.
At some point, she was tired and she could not walk anymore. And she decided to rest under a tree. And under that tree, she decided to put me down. So I was on the floor, back in the tree, leaning on the tree. And I remember asking my mom why I was that ill, why I was that sick. And she told me, I don't know. And I said, but what did they say is a problem? And my mom said, the doctor said that you had malaria. And I asked her the other question, why is it that there is no cure for this disease that is making me this sick? And I see a lot of children who were that sick. Many of them died because of that same sickness. She said she doesn't know why there is no cure for it. And I remember vividly on that day, I told her, when I grow up, if this disease is still on, I will find a cure for it. That's what I told my mom that day. That was the very first thing that actually shaped my life, shaped my career. Then the second thing that happened a few years later, I was in high school, and I think I was around 16, 17, and we were studying biology, and we were studying the DNA. And in my textbook, I saw this picture of Watson, James Watson and Francis Crick. And it was
Yeah.
people that discovered the DNA, discovered the structure of the DNA. And I remember my biology teacher telling us how the DNA is a very important molecule, that anything that has life has a DNA in it. And at that age, I could make the connection between the DNA and the malaria parasite. So in my
Yeah.
head, the malaria parasite has a DNA. If you take out the DNA out of the malaria parasite, then you can kill the malaria parasite. So I have created that connection at the time. And then I passed my baccalaureate, which is like A level with flying color. Actually, I was the best student in my province. Studying biology, mathematics, chemistry, and others, I was definitely designed to go to medical school at my time, because when you were at that top level, the best student used to go to medical school.
Yeah.
Shockingly, I made a shocking decision because Watson and Crick were biochemists when I read that. For those two people, I had a very admiration for biochemists. And I made a decision that shocked everybody in my family, my uncle, everybody, or my uncles, everybody, my aunts, my parents. They expected me to go to medical school, but I came to them and I told them, you know what, I'm not going to the medical school. I'm going to the Faculty of Science to study biochemistry. Faculty of Science at the University of Yale. And that created a lot of trouble. I remember one of my uncles traveling. He traveled, I tell you, almost 600 kilometers just to come and tell me that, look, I don't think you're making the right decision. You're going to be the first doctor in the family. You're going to be this, you're going to be that. Doctors are
Yeah.
respected and everything. Why are you not going to make it that? I heard this. I think it's a terrible decision. It's a very wrong decision. I want you to change your mind. Go to medical school. I told my uncle, I'm going to study biochemistry because I want to be a biochemist. I want to discover. And what was behind in my mind was to discover something related to the malaria parasite.
Yeah.
That was exactly what drove me. And I went to study biochemistry with the mindset of study. And very interestingly, we studied technology. Part of the program was biotechnology, where we studied recombinant DNA technology. I could see the power behind that technology. And when I finished my first degree in biochemistry, I decided to look for a program that were studying the biology of malaria, and I could apply recombinant DNA technology to malaria. And I found a program at the University of Ibadan at the time under one Professor Mark Nwago. He had a program called cellular and molecular parasitology, and in that program, he was really studying at cellular level. And malaria parasite was one of those parasites that he was studying because he had a research program on malaria where he was applying knowledge of biotechnology to malaria. I applied for that program. I was taken for that program to do a master's degree. I joined the program and I found that very fascinating. That's where I started. I learned how to hold micropipette and then a whole lot of things. That's why I started having a handle and understanding the power behind it, behind biotechnology and malaria. When I finished my master's degree program, I studied that. I was looking for a program at the PhD level that was going to address the malaria parasite issue once and for all. I identified a program with Professor Ian Teague at the University of Melbourne at the time. He was developing a vaccine using apical membrane antigen for malaria called the AMA1. And he had made a lot of progress in developing that vaccine candidate, and I decided to apply to his program in Australia. I did apply and then got what I call an OPRS, which is Overseas Postgraduate Research Scholarship, that at the University of Melbourne. I got everything that I needed. I got a visa. I got everything that I needed to travel to Australia. I got a ticket and everything. Interestingly, and then I saw they do research on different things, and malaria is one of those research. I said, "Oh, come on, what are you guys doing? What malaria research are they doing?" Oh, the secretary at the time told me that, oh, there's a professor here. He studied malaria. I cannot tell you much about it, but I think if you meet him, he can tell you a lot more about what
Mm-hmm.
his program is. And Dola, who was director of the institute at the time and then leading the malaria research program there, I requested to meet him. And he was pretty generous. He invited me to his office and asked all my questions. What are you doing on malaria parasite? What are you doing? He explained to me what he was doing. And then I told him about my interest in solving the malaria problem and by vaccine against malaria. He told me at the time that, young man, I can see the fire in your eyes. I can see the passion in you. I can see that you have so much energy. You want to solve these problems, but I want to give you a piece of advice. The malaria vaccine development is not a joke. It's a very complex it's a very, very complex thing. That
Mm-hmm.
maybe you and I may not live in our lifetime to see a malaria vaccine developed and implemented in Africa.
Wow.
And I said, why? And they said, look, it is complicated. It needs a lot of resources. You gave me a lot of argument.
Yeah.
And he was working on understanding the mechanisms of resistance to anti-malarial drugs in Africa. He was thinking about creating on the continent to see if it can prevent drug resistance. That was
Yeah.
something I didn't know much about. But then by the time he told, and he said, young man, I can see that you have the fire. But if you can see you want to make an impact in your lifetime, but if you really want to make an impact, why can't you think about solving or addressing a problem that is much more easier? That is understanding the mechanism of drug resistance and finding solution to drug resistance, because a lot of children die because when they are treated with chloroquine at the time, they don't respond
Mm-hmm.
to the drug.
Yeah.
Through that challenge to me on that, at that conversation, and I went to the library. I was reading about this drug resistance thing, trying to understand it, and I found it fascinating. And I made another decision that a lot of people thought that was completely irrational. I reached out to Professor Ian Tilly a few days later. I told him, thank you for the opportunity, support for me to get the overseas postgraduate research scholarship and the opportunity to join you as a graduate student in your lab. But unfortunately, I don't think I will come to Australia. That was another crazy move that everybody knew I was going to, Americans and everybody knew I was going to Australia. But when I told them I wasn't going anymore, they said, what are you doing? I said, no, I think I will stay here and try to study this malaria parasite, and then probably this drug resistant thing seems to be maybe a way forward.
Yeah.
My friends and colleagues were like, how on earth would you make just such a terrible decision? You are leaving, you are going to, you're a country where you have everything. You got a program, you got a stipend, you got a fellowship, you have everything
Mm-hmm.
funded, fully funded PhD program. You are abandoning a fully funded PhD program to join a program that is offering you nothing, because they're asking me, do you have the resources to run this program? I'm like, no. How are you going to do it? I said, don't worry. I'm sure it will work. I'll look for resources. But then you don't have the resources. Come on, you're a poor guy. I said, don't worry. I think I'm very convinced that I can do this. So I joined Professor Ayodola, who is one of my mentors, and we started our journey. And I can tell you that the first thing I did was to really sit down and plan how I wanted to do my research. And planning out how I wanted to do my research at the time, I started thinking about sequencing the malaria parasite and areas where we are suspecting genes to be involved, sequencing them, clone them, vectors, and then see whether that can change phenotype. These are in 96 at the time.
Wow.
People at the time where we have genome sequences has not become something that was real. It was just something in my head. When I presented my idea to my professor, he looked at it. It's incredible. But how is this feasible? I told him that there must be a way to do it. You know what I told him? He didn't discourage me. He told me, you got great ideas, but I think my only fear is that I don't know the feasibility could be a big challenge for you.
Yeah.
I said, don't worry, it will be feasible. But then he had an opportunity where they have the Gordon Research Conference, GRC. And the very first Gordon Research Conference on malaria occurred a few months after I joined him. And I wrote an idea, my proposal. I put that in an abstract, showing how you could actually solve the malaria problem, identify the markers and the genes involved in malaria drug resistance or chloroquine resistance and other
Yeah.
drugs by using that approach. I submitted that abstract. My abstract was retained, and then I had to go to Oxford at the first Gordon Research Conference in 1996 or 98, yeah, to present my work. I got all the necessary paperwork to go to Oxford, and then I got to the Oxford in London. I got to London at the airport, and we got all the information that we needed at the time. That you land here, Terminal 4, then you go out, you turn
Yeah.
right, you walk this way, and then you go to find a bus, and then that bus is going to Oxford, and then you just go to that bus. So I was following the instruction, and then I found a bus that was going to take us from London Heathrow to Oxford University for the conference. I dropped my bag in the bus, and as I was about to go and enter the bus, I saw one elderly lady for me compared to my age at the time. A lady coming, she was carrying three suitcases. She was rolling three suitcases alone. And she had a backpack, and then she had a handbag, and then she had another bag. So that was a lot of load that she was carrying. And I went straight to her, to help. My mother has always told me, if you see a woman and you need of help, please offer help. If you see a pregnant woman, actually drop everything that you are doing to give her help. These were the things that my mother kept telling me, and I just practiced that day. I went straight to this woman who was carrying a lot of load, tried to help her. She was like, "No need, thank you very much. I appreciate your help. I'm okay." I wrestled her, the suitcases, shoved them under the bus, and then went straight. After doing that, I just went straight and sat down. I think that singular action of mine, thinking. She's like, man, probably a young man, very nice. I don't know what was in her head. But I went to sit by the window. I took a window seat on the bus. I was just more interested in sightseeing than any other thing. And this lady walked into the bus and then came to me, right beside me. And she, first of all, thanked me about, a kind gesture, and I appreciated it. And then she asked me, "Where are you going?" And I told her I was going to Oxford. And she's like, "Okay, what are you going to do in Oxford?" I told her I'm going for this Gordon Research Conference. And I told her about that. Going to present the talk on malaria. And she was asking me, "What is malaria all about? What is your talk all about?" I gave her. I told her. And then she's like, "Oh, you see malaria patients." So she was asking me a lot of questions, and I was answering. But I told her about how, I said, okay, how do you think you can solve this problem that you mentioned? I told her how I was going to use genomic sequencing to identify these potential, and then cloning, and do all this in vitro testing to identify potential markers for drug resistant malaria. The whole story short, Khalifa, this lady was Professor Diane Ward from Harvard University. She was the chair of the conference I was going to. She didn't tell me throughout this conversation that she was the chair of the conference I was going to. She didn't introduce herself to me the way she just told me she was Diane, that's all. I didn't know who she was. I didn't know that, she was asking me those questions. She was fascinated with my thinking process. She was fascinated about the innovation into my thinking. And then we got to Oxford, and I came down. I took my bag. I pulled her own bag. I took all her bags out, handed it over to her, and she took a cab and then went. And I was trekking, following the instruction on the paper to go to the hostel. I got to the hostels, and then the next day we went to the conference. And we got to the conference, and I saw the organizing committee of the conference, and there was this lady sitting on the chair of the conference. She was looking like the lady I helped yesterday.
Yeah.
But I was more than convinced that it couldn't be the lady I helped yesterday, because she didn't say anything about this conference. She didn't introduce herself as the chair of the conference. I was the youngest participant at the conference because there were some very big guys. I read their articles in Science, Nature, all of those big guys, Chris Newbold, all those big names. It was pretty intimidating. All the big names. You can imagine, you see all big authors and things.
Yeah.
So during coffee break, our first coffee break, I had to go and then get my coffee, and then because I was so intimidated. I just went in my little corner. I was just there, admiring all these great references. And this lady walked her way through the crowd and came to me, and she told me, "Thank you very much for the help you gave me yesterday, that I'm grateful." It got dawned on me that I was all along with the chair of the conference. But I said, "You didn't say anything about you being the chair of the conference." She said, "It doesn't matter. You know, told me one thing. Yeah." She said, "You got fire in your brain." That's what she told me. That
Yeah.
I'm so fascinated. The way you're thinking, I'm so interested in it. And the next thing she told me, she said, "You know what? What you were saying yesterday really got me thinking a lot. That I can't imagine a young man from Africa thinking about genome sequencing of the malaria parasite. When a committee at NIH, we had a committee of famous scientists in the world working on malaria. About 2 or 3 weeks ago, she said about 2 weeks ago, sat down and then they had a meeting for a few days, 3 days, and then they came out with a white paper. And that white paper, they were still developing it. And that white paper was to actually set up first sequencing of the malaria parasite genome in order to understand. And she said she was so puzzled that a young man from Africa who was not at this meeting, for some moments she asked me a lot of questions. She wanted to find out if I know a lot of people. And I kept saying no, because she thought that maybe the minute leaked. She thought that it leaked because how could a young man in Africa think about sequencing the malaria parasite genome? At NIH were also thinking about it.
Yeah.
But I realized I didn't know anybody among the people that were in the meeting, so that there was no leakage. And that was when, say that my career and everything changed. Because there, she said, "It's impressive for you to think that way. But then, can I extend an invitation for you to come to Harvard to visit?"
Mm-hmm.
Of course, I said yes. And then we finished the conference. 2 weeks later, I got an invitation later and everything. I went to the embassy, got the visa, and then went to Harvard. And then when I got there, she told me, "I wanted to talk to the faculties and then just tell them exact the things you were telling me in Oxford. Just the exact things you were telling me in Oxford. Don't say it beyond that. Just take time." I was there 2 days preparing my presentation. And then I eventually, in those days, we used to use transparency. So you need to draw everything by hand, you need to write everything by hand. So, and I think 2 days later, I gave a talk to the faculty, and they were just like fascinated and impressed. That's how, she over my mentoring, and then really brought me down up to this level. Eventually joined her at Harvard, working with her. We did a lot of discoveries together, did a lot of great stuff, malaria parasite, discovering markers and all kinds of things all together. And then that really, played a critical role, in career growth and in my career development. And along with Professor Ayo, and then eventually, up and joined the faculty at Harvard, and eventually returned to Nigeria in 2011, and then started doing all of the work that you see in malaria and viral hemorrhagic fevers. That's a bit of who I am.
Wow, wow. It's a rich story to tell. I mean, I listened to you the whole day, but it truly goes to tell how, developed from early onset, all the way to what you've become now. That's an amazing story. I know a lot of African scholars have stories, but it's truly, truly. So I want us to talk a little bit about the Africa Center of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Diseases. I know you've built it into one of the most respected scientific institutions on the continent. But if you could take us to the beginning, what was the original vision behind it, and how has that vision evolved over time?
I want to say that the Africa Center of Excellence for Genomic of Infectious Disease that has grown in a way to evolve, and then from which a whole Institute of Genomics and Global Health has birthed, is a dream, and it's a vision that I had many years ago. While I was at Harvard doing all this malaria work and things that I was telling you, you are out there in pristine laboratories doing fantastic, great work. But anytime you open the internet and looking at news from Africa, I'm pretty much interested in health news from the continent. And it is always some sad news about some disease, outbreaks, some mysterious disease killing people here and there, some disease that you know about, some others that you don't even know about. You keep hearing about people dying of some diseases. In 2007, I was reading newspapers from Africa, and then I saw a very terrible news that was saying that the disease called Lassa fever just killed about 50 something people in Nigeria. And I picked interest in that, and I was like, this is the first time I'm hearing about this disease called Lassa fever. Is it something new? And I realized that it was a disease that was reported, that had been reported for the first time in Nigeria in 1969. And I asked myself the question, so why is it that from 69 to now, there's really no diagnostics? Because when I read the number of death, and then in that same article, it was written that the sample were taken to, I think, in Hamburg, in Germany, and then the result was out maybe about a month or more after. And then after that, I think by the time the result came back, they had lost about 90% of the people. That really struck me. And then I was like, God, why should we do this? I was working in the space of genomics, and we were doing that for malaria parasite, and really started thinking about how we could move genomics in Africa, create diagnostics, and then use genomics as to understand disease pathologies and everything, and then use that to accelerate things like vaccine development. That was really when I started really thinking about how to make that move that could enable us create a center on the continent that can leverage advances in genomics to accelerate science development on the continent and actually develop countermeasures. I was very much interested not only to do genomics epidemiology, but actually to do translational genomics in order to use genomic data to find real solutions. We're
Hmm.
very good on the continent to describe problems, but we're really
Yeah.
not too good in Africa to identify solution or to propose solution to problems. And I was very determined to actually do what a lot of people don't do in our own space. That is to identify problems instead of describing them, but prefer a solution to them. So I made a bold move in 2011 to leave Harvard and then to come to Nigeria, the largest country in Africa in terms of population, but also the largest country in the world with the black people concentration. And the core was really how to come and impact our people. The idea was if you impact people in Nigeria, I think you will definitely have a greater impact in Africa. That's definitely my philosophy, and that's the way I've always thought. So I made that move back to Nigeria in 2011 and joined Redeemers University. That was when I fully came back and said, okay, here I'm fully back. Joining Redeemers University at the time, I met an inspirational African leader, which was Professor Yewale Tomori. He was actually the driver behind my joining Redeemers University, and I joined Redeemers University because of him. Because he was so insistent. He wanted me to be back. He wanted me to join them. He wanted me to, and was pretty flexible. He was very open to the fact that one could come and then change the paradigm. Then the second thing, it was a private university where you have more freedom, where you could actually, they were more flexible in doing for the potential disruption kind of work that I was could do on the system. And I did join them. And a year and a half thereabout after I joined them, I was still thinking about. Let me put it within a year after I joined them, I wrote a grant to NIH, applying for a grant and then seeking for resources to establish actually a center of excellence for genomics for
Yeah.
research. And then I submitted that grant, and then I got seed funding of about $1.2 million thereby. But then a few months later, after I got that grant, then there was a call from the World Bank, establish centers of excellence in West Africa.
Hmm.
Fortunately for this call, institutions in Nigeria, I think the Nigerian government was gracious to give the opportunity to private university to apply for this call. Of course, we did apply for that call, and we eventually came up actually in the whole of West Africa. We came on top, in the whole of West Africa in terms of proposals.
Yeah.
That's how we leverage both the NIH and then the World Bank funding to establish the African Center of Excellence for Genomic of Infectious Disease. That's how that center came to bear. Yeah.
Looking at our response so far to public health crisis, take Ebola, COVID-19, and now mpox, do you think these experiences reveal about our public health capacity, specifically
I do
within the African context?
I do think that the response in Africa has really transformed the way we respond to epidemics. If you see what has transformed epidemic response in the world today is actually the Ebola outbreak in Africa in 2014. If you look at the landscape before Ebola in 2014, anytime there used to be an outbreak in Africa, WHO will send experts in court in Africa. They will come tell us what to do, and then eventually the sample will be taken to some lab somewhere in Europe in probably a high level containment facility. And maybe a year or two later, they will tell us what happened 2 or 3 years ago in this place, or what was responsible for this disease outbreak, and that killed so this number of people in this particular virus. But that changed in 2014 when we definitely has established the Africa Center of Excellence for Genomic of Infectious Disease. And I can tell you that immediately after we established our center and signed the agreement with the World Bank, where we were proposing for them to change the way you can use genomic as a way to respond to epidemics and then to create solutions. That was our baptism of fire. We signed the agreement around December 2013, and I can tell you that by April, we were actually receiving our first baptism. Ebola outbreak of Guinea to Sierra Leone in Liberia. I was doing some work on Lassa fever in Sierra Leone. We had to drop everything we were doing to face Ebola.
Ebola.
But I can tell you that that is where I would say the Africa response became transformational. How did the Africa response become transformational? The very first thing we did was to change the paradigm and then the way you think about responding to epidemics. We brought in what we call near real-time genomic sequencing.
Mm-hmm.
We sequenced the first 99 genomes of the Ebola virus. That in real time on the African continent. The second thing we did is that we transformed the way we actually data sharing. We made this data available to the rest of the world, free of charge and freely accessible. So in real essence, we pioneered open data sharing and open data access during an outbreak.
Okay.
Third, third thing we did, we realized around June 16, 2014, that one particular variant or one particular strain or one particular virus in Sierra Leone was spreading much more faster and has masked every other virus circulating, because at the time we noticed about three different strains circulating. And we characterized that virus. We see it has about 327 mutations and been 21 were well fixated around the RDP gene. So that's when we actually discovered the whole process, concept of variants of concern. We explained the reason why this variant was spreading much more faster. It has acquired mutation that enabled it to spread much more faster than other variants. That is the third pillar, discovery of regions of concern. The fourth thing we did, shocked the world, was the fact that we understood that PCR technology was a big hindrance to the control of that outbreak. It was taking 72 hours, 96 hours to actually do one single test. Some patients that were actually had malaria fever because they had fever, and every fever at the time was assumed to be Ebola test. Actually, will go to hospital, get infected there, and then bring the infection back home. PCR had become a major hindrance to curbing down the virus because of the backlog, because of the large numbers. We decided that it's better to actually create a test that could be faster, cheaper, and more efficient, or equally efficient like PCR. We did the first translational genomic work during an epidemic. We went from the genome that we sequenced to create the first rapid diagnostic test for Ebola that was approved by the WHO and the US FDA under emergency use authorization. The introduction of that test in countries like Sierra Leone and the West African region is absolutely the key determining factors that actually start seeing flattening the curve of the outbreak. The fifth thing we did was basically to build the local capacity so that they can actually start doing all this thing by themselves and own up the data, own up the result, and then they became the leaders in doing all this. All the five pillars that I mentioned to you are the five pillars that the world actually used in 2020 to respond to COVID-19. Now, to show the power of the approach that we actually brought to bear during the 2014 Ebola outbreak in Nigeria. July 2014, a suspected patient from Liberia lands in Nigeria and collapses at the airport. He is taken to a private hospital, and then all the tests done there prove negative
Mm-hmm.
for malaria and then some other tests, typhoid, all of those things. Because he was suspect, because he came from Liberia, he was a high dignitary and a civil servant who was going for a conference in Nigeria. Then they said, well, let's just see whether we can try to test for Ebola. The next day, the samples are sent to my lab at 8:40 p.m. on July 21. The same night, I go to the lab with one assistant in the BSL, not category 4, not the level 4 containment. The only thing I had PPEs, I have everything because I've worked in Sierra Leone, I stopped the lab, I had diagnostics made, we had everything ready, and within hours, we established the fact that we had Ebola in Nigeria.
Wow.
This information is given to all the people, public health authorities in Nigeria, and they will start working together. This gentleman is neutralized, he's not allowed to continue his journey. And then we work day and night with public health authorities in Nigeria, sharing results as they come in, sequencing the samples and providing this in real time, enabling to a transmission chains, knowing who is giving what virus to who. And this is how we're able to contain Ebola in an incredible way in Nigeria. In 93 days, the virus is contained in 93 days. It stops there. And we have only 20 cases and 8 deaths. Africa shows the lead, and it
Wow.
shows how we could do this. This is just to tell you that that was the first demonstration of the fact that what we do work and can work well. We brought innovation, we brought speed, we brought accuracy, and that really showed that it can work. This framework that we built in 2014 is what the world used to respond to COVID-19. Remember when COVID-19 happened, near real-time genomic was what we were using to establish transmission chain and to identify new variants, right? Actually is the second thing. Thirdly, translational genomics is because Moderna and other people saw what we did during this Ebola in 2014, going from genome sequences to diagnostics. They believed that it was possible to go from genome sequences to vaccine. Going, and eventually, diagnostic tests and everything that we did, it was a copycat. We created a model that the world used, and it proved to be very effective. But most importantly is the fact that in 2020, as you were talking about the African response, you mentioned COVID. The African response for COVID was incredible. Whether people like it or not, Africa dodged the bullet because we have the knowledge, we have the skill. It's not, you don't throw money at an epidemic. You use
Yeah.
knowledge and skill and experience. And that's what we did. Remember, we were in the kitchen cabinet of the people at Africa CDC at the time. We used a variety of approaches. The whole continent of Africa shut down to the rest of the world within 48 hours. And most importantly, the first case of COVID was reported in Africa, was reported in Egypt. The second case of COVID in Africa was reported, the second country in Africa to report COVID was South Africa. The third country in Africa to report COVID was Nigeria. However, the difference between Egypt, South Africa, and Nigeria is the fact that while Egypt had and they didn't know what to do with it, Egypt and South Africa had the virus and they didn't know what to do with it. Within 48 hours of getting the sample of the suspected case for COVID-19 in Nigeria, we have sequenced the virus and we have generated the first whole genome of SARS-CoV-2 in Africa in 48 hours. That is an unprecedented speed that you cannot see anywhere else. And what is interesting is the fact that we share this protocol with our colleagues and friends
Mm-hmm.
across the continent.
Yeah.
And you could see Africans, our South African brothers going to discover the beta variant, even though we're stigmatized against after doing what is good for the public health. I mean, for public, you could see our brothers in Botswana going to discover the Omicron variant.
Yeah.
So if you want to say that the response is this and that, I tell you that we change the world. We change the way we
Yeah.
respond to
Yeah.
epidemic, and Africa should be given its right position. Should be given credit. We should credit to do what we've done, and we
Yeah.
should be given credit for innovation, for creativity, and then to lead by example. That is sharing information that help the next generation vaccines and the next generation drugs that you saw in the market.
And I think you've rightly nailed. I think like amazing stories to be told, and I know there are still a lot of people, even African professionals, who are oblivious to this fact that a lot is happening in Africa. A lot of hard work is going on in Africa, but it seems we are not telling the story, and I think that has one aspect of letting the world. Africa has the capacity, and we've been doing this for a long. So thank you. That I think it's to you and listening and knowing the work that has come out from Africa. So I think it's truly. Thank you so much for sharing that detailed work that you've been doing on the continent. I must say I'm truly impressed by the level of quality work coming out of the continent. But I want us to shift a little to workforce development. And in your view, the most critical gaps that you see in Africa and how we are currently preparing the next generation of public health leaders. What are some of the gaps that you've identified, and how do you think we can train the next generation to be ready for what's to come next?
I think one of the major critical gaps that you see in the African continent is actually the number of people with skill. This is human resources, people with knowledge. And I believe strongly in one thing. While other areas of public health are important, I believe that genomics could be the greatest equalizer. Genomics is that approach, or is that technology, is that knowledge, is a science that can enable Africa accelerate its health development and then catch up to the rest of the world, or if not, overtake the rest of the world. And I believe that Africa can overtake the rest of the world because of one major thing. If you look at the African continent, it's a continent that is endowed in mineral resources. It's a continent that is endowed in human resources, but it's also a continent that is endowed. It's very powerful biodiversity. The very powerful biodiversity that Africa has is not just for plant biodiversity, it's also for its own ecosystem. And then, as part of the African biodiversity, you have microbes, you have parasites, and then, of course, you have viruses.
Hmm.
And for me, I look at this as gift. I don't look at them as challenges. They're actually gift because Africa can leverage that to actually be creator of knowledge, create innovation, and
Hmm.
make innovation and sell this innovation to the world.
Yeah.
And that is the reason why I think Africa just need to build this workforce in order to harness what is in our biodiversity in order and generate the new knowledge and the technologies that are required in order to advance science and development on the continent. We need to train the next generation of leaders, and we
Hmm.
have to be very intentional in the way we train them. When intentional is, we need to actually set up training programs that are geared toward addressing those local problems in a
Hmm.
way that others people are not. Nobody's going to come from outside to tell us. If we're expecting people to come out from outside and tell us how to solve our problem, we are fooling ourselves. We need to look inward. We need to look at our problems and then design ways of addressing them and
Yeah.
actually selling those technologies to the rest of the world. Africa should be in the leadership position, should be in the driver's seat when it comes to addressing issues related to infectious diseases and non-communicable disease. I'm very clear about that. And because of the biodiversity that is existing, from the human genome to the pathogens that are circulating in Africa, these are wealth in disguise. So, and as such, we have to be intentional in training the workforce. We have to train a critical mass of well trained young African scientists, especially in the area of genomics, that
Hmm.
can leverage the knowledge and the skills of genomics, not only to address, to contain issues or find solutions to control of infectious disease and viral infections, but also creating novel technologies that can help us accelerate vaccines development, drug development, and others. And I can take an example just to prove to you how this can be feasible. In 2015, for instance, when we, my group, sequenced the first set of genomes of the Lassa fever virus, I told you about this before. We did the first sequence of the genomes, and we realized that this virus is multiple, there are multiple lineages of the virus that are circulating. But most importantly is that we found that this virus emerged from present-day Nigeria about 1,186 years ago, was circulating within Nigeria for about 600 years and moved out of Nigeria toward the other West African country about 400 years ago. But this information that we provided were very critical an accelerated vaccine against this particular virus. Between the time where we actually created this first genome, or we generated the first genome of this virus, and 2020, that is in the span of 5 years, there were two vaccine candidates for this virus. As I'm speaking to you today, two of them are undergoing clinical trial here in Nigeria. It shows you the power of creativity, it shows you the power of innovation, and how you could use that to transform the health landscape. So it means that we can actually knowledge, can use this skill and actually the genomic skill to transform the way we could do things. And training is core to it. In 2020, during the COVID-19 pandemic, my group would train over, between 2020 and probably 2024, would train over 2,500 young African scientists from 53 of the 54 African countries. All over Africa, we have our stand. But what is important about what I'm telling you, the value of training, is the fact that in 2020, for instance, only two laboratories in Africa produced over 5,000 genome sequence. Those laboratories were my laboratory in Nigeria and then Dr. Tulio de Oliveira in South Africa, in Sarah. But because we identified training as a very powerful way to address this epidemic, we train people. And guess what? Between the number of 2020, between January 2020, 2021, September, the number of SARS-CoV-2 genomes in Africa, we went from 5,000 genomes to 100,000 genomes. And when I talk about sequencing, I'm not talking about sequencing just to know the variant that are circulating. We use that as a way to identify the hotspot, establish transmission chains, and eventually use the information to guide government so that they will know where to go and make the necessary intervention, where to lock down, where to actually just focus so that you can contain an epidemic. It gives you the power of training and building the capacity. However, the kind of training that we provided is not sufficient enough to put Africa to a position where he could actually be transformation. We've trained people that can do genomic sequencing and do genomic epidemiology work. But what Africa needs now is actually to be very intentional in the translational bit of the training. We need to train translators, people that can take genomic knowledge to create the next generation vaccine, technology to create the next generation diagnostics and drugs. And that's really where we should focus. And that's where we should actually train a lot of people, because this can be applied for infectious disease and non-communicable disease and non-communicable diseases.
Yeah.
So very important. And for me, I think that that's where, I should hear of African response, for instance, to epidemic and actually to health development on the continent.
Yeah. You've a very critical with the issue of training the next generation of, like, let's say, translators, those who can take the knowledge in genomics and transform them into biologics, we actually need on the continent. And I think when recently I spoke to Dr. Bassi, who I think also in the biotech industry, who is also trying, I think he's also based in Nigeria, trying to see how he can set up, Africa that could help accelerate our independence when it comes to genomics, and also translating it to vaccine for the continent. So, not least question, if so, to design, let's say, a continent-wide public health leadership, what be non-negotiable in your of the training? What do you think would be non-negotiable?
We need to set some good standard. We need to set something that we wouldn't negotiate with. We need to set some very good standard. We need to make this program very competitive. We need to bring together very creative minds and bring them in the same environment where they can interact, and then create that next generation. Those next generation biologics and countermeasures that we're talking about. Standard is going to be, we also need to think, we make sure that we're training them in environments that are really ideal, forward thinking, environment where they have access to facilities. We cannot afford to be training them in places where they are looking for water, they're looking for things. We need to put them in ideal condition. But most importantly, I think we need to think about retaining the talent that we're training in Africa. We should stop thinking about training people for the purpose of training. There should be a follow-up after training. When we're training people, we're training them for purpose, but we also need to make sure that we have the resources to retain them. And the non-negotiable for me would be make sure that we put in competitive salaries that can maintain young African in Africa. There's no point paying a postdoc in Africa less than you pay in America. There's no point paying a graduate student, or I mean, incentive to a graduate student here less than what you give in America. We need to let them know that there is a career path. They need to know that that they can succeed in doing science for development. They need to understand that they can take care of their families as they are working and
Yeah.
sacrificing to do all of the work that they're doing. They need to understand that being a researcher and being an academic shouldn't, show a poor person. They need to understand that you can earn a living, if not a better living, where you are doing the kind of work that we're doing. And for me, those are the non-negotiable. Nobody should come and tell me because that training in Africa should earn less. I can tell you, and I challenge anyone, people training in Africa should actually earn more because the conditions here are a bit more complicated.
That's absolutely true, and I agree with you 100%. If government were to provide enough incentives for our professionals, we would have developed our sectors way in most countries. But rightly said, it's really frustrating for young scholars who are also trying to, career and also nurture their family when it comes to the point that they have to choose between, also making sure they are comfortable. It becomes a real challenge. So I agree with that unnegotiable fact. But we usually have, questions. Um, so you're not in the lab or when you're not at conferences, what do you like to do for fun? Like what your main hobbies?
Yeah, there are two things that I do for fun. I say three things. I have quite a bit. I like hanging on with my family. Then the second thing that I do, I play golf, and then I also love reading. So those are the things that I do.
Okay. You any favorite sports team? Like
Ah,
do you watch soccer or any other sports? Not
I
really.
don't I have a very strong opinion. I better not express it here. I don't watch soccer.
Okay, anyway.
Yeah, I'll tell you about that privately, but I have a very strong opinion about that. But it's not for this.
Okay. I know you say you've been in Nigeria for a long time. Is a particular dish in Nigeria that it's your number one go-to?
There are quite a number of dishes here. Yam is great. Have things like so is really great. So there are a lot of vegetables, and I think Nigeria is a great place. It's a great country. So I think there's a lot in Nigeria that you can enjoy. Other
Yeah.
people. It's unfortunate that people look at Nigeria as spot, but I can tell you it's one of the best places in the world. If you, Nigeria shouldn't be seen in the light that people see it. They are very entrepreneurial people. They are great minds. They are great people. I think it's always very offensive when for me see people saying negative things about Nigeria because I think there's a lot here that
Yeah.
can be very transformational, not only for Africa but for the world.
That's I mean, worked with and you've been in class with them, you truly know that they are one of the amazing
Yeah,
you can ever have within your circles. And Ghana and Nigeria have this sister brother beef, but it's always
yeah,
in
yeah.
good light. And
Yes,
get that.
absolutely. Yeah.
But go your last words to young public health professionals who are looking at how the world is going and how public health the whole field is transforming. Any words for them?
I would tell, especially in the context of Africa, a good example, Khalifa. How you do it. You are in postcast, you are MD, you have a master's degree, you have an MBA, you're doing a PhD. So I think, I would tell them to dream big, and be transformational in your dreams, and then let nobody tell you that you cannot achieve your dream. I think that's definitely, and then the future of public health or the future of global health is in Africa, and it will be in the hands of young Africans that decide to make that bold move, back and then to skills and knowledge and technology, and unravel a lot of the things that the world hasn't known, and then use that as a way to enhance health in the world. I think dream big, be transformational in your dreams, and then let nobody tells you that, do great and beautiful things from Africa.
Thank you for an encouraging conclusion to the podcast. We appreciate your time. We know how busy you are. Try to set this up. To have you on this platform, and I'm sure people or more young folks will be inspired to something unique for the continent. So thank you so much for being
Thank
with
you.
us.